Life seemed picture-perfect for Amy Chen as she walked down the bustling halls of Roosevelt High School. At 17, she was everything a parent could hope for: smart, kind, and determined. But being the daughter of one of the FBI's top agents wasn't always easy. Sometimes it felt like she was living in a fishbowl, with everyone watching her every move. That morning started like any other. Amy stood at her locker, organizing her color-coded notebooks, while her best friend Lily chatted about the upcoming science fair. The fluorescent lights bounced off Amy's perfectly pressed student body president badge, a small reminder of the expectations she carried on her shoulders. "Did you finish the chemistry project?" Lily asked, twirling her pen nervously. "I stayed up until midnight working on mine." Amy smiled, pulling out her completed project. "I did it right after volunteering at the shelter yesterday. Those puppies give me all the motivation I need to get my work done early." What most people didn't know was that behind Amy's perfect grades and volunteer work lay a deeper story. Her dad, Agent David Chen, had raised her alone since she was 8. Between his demanding job at the FBI and being a single parent, he taught her the value of discipline and integrity. Every morning, he'd leave a sticky note on the fridge with the same message: "Make good choices, stay strong, and remember who you are." The halls quieted as Principal Rodriguez approached. "Amy, do you have a moment? The school board loved your proposal for the anti-bullying program. They want you to present it at next month's district meeting." Amy's face lit up. This was her passion project, creating a safe space for students who felt voiceless. She'd seen enough injustice in the world through her father's work to know that standing up for others mattered more than anything. During lunch break, Amy sat with her diverse group of friends in the courtyard. There was Lily, the science whiz; Tom, the basketball player who secretly wrote poetry; and Nina, whose artwork had already won state competitions. They were discussing their plans for college when Amy's phone buzzed with a text from her dad. "Great news, kiddo. Got the weekend off. Movie marathon." Amy couldn't help but smile. These rare moments with her father were precious. Between his undercover operations and high-profile cases, quality time was hard to come by. She quickly texted back a row of excited emojis, already planning their traditional popcorn and blanket fort setup. As the afternoon classes rolled by, Amy helped younger students with their homework in the library. Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, watched her with knowing eyes. "You know, Amy, you remind me of your father when he was your age. Always helping others, standing up for what's right. Though I hope you're getting more sleep than he did." That was the thing about being Agent Chen's daughter. Everyone who knew him had a story to tell. He'd built a reputation not just as a fierce FBI agent, but as someone who genuinely cared about people. Amy hoped to live up to that legacy, but in her own way. After school, she headed to the animal shelter for her regular volunteer shift. The familiar bark of dogs and meow of cats greeted her as she walked in. Here, she wasn't the FBI agent's daughter or the perfect student. She was just Amy, the girl who sang to scared puppies and read stories to lonely cats. Little did Amy know that tomorrow would change everything. As she drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to be turned upside down. But that's the thing about life. Sometimes the biggest tests come when you least expect them, and how you handle them defines who you really are. Her father always said that character isn't built in moments of comfort, but in moments of challenge. Amy was about to learn exactly what that meant. The sun was setting as Amy pulled out of the animal shelter's parking lot, her car filled with the lingering scent of pet shampoo from bathing puppies all afternoon. She hummed along to her favorite song, thinking about the upcoming weekend movie marathon with her dad. It had been weeks since they'd spent quality time together, and she couldn't wait to raid their secret snack stash. The familiar route home took her through the quiet suburbs, past rows of neat houses with perfectly trimmed lawns. She checked her speed regularly, Being an FBI agent's daughter had taught her to always follow traffic rules to the letter. The digital clock on her dashboard read 6:45 p.m. when she noticed the police cruiser trailing behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it. But after 3 turns, the cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life, its siren giving a short whoop. Amy's heart jumped, but she remained calm, remembering her father's lessons about traffic stops. She signaled properly and pulled over, positioning her car safely on the shoulder of the road. Following everything she'd been taught, Amy turned off the engine, placed her hands on the steering wheel, and waited. Through her side mirror, she watched an officer approach, young, probably in his late 20s, with a swagger in his step that seemed out of place for a routine traffic stop. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his flashlight beam hitting her eyes directly despite the sky still being fairly bright. Amy squinted but maintained her composure, reaching slowly for her documents in the glove compartment. "Officer Wells," she read his nameplate, keeping her voice steady and polite. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer's expression changed when he saw her ID, his eyes lingering on her address. The same as a well-known FBI agent. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone shifting from professional to something harder. Amy's hands trembled slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt. This wasn't right. She hadn't done anything wrong. Other cars slowed as they passed by, drivers craning their necks to watch. A few even pulled over, phones already out and recording. "Officer, I don't understand what's happening," Amy said, standing beside her car now. The evening air felt suddenly cold against her skin. "I've had my eye on this neighborhood," Officer Wells said, circling her like a shark. "Lots of privileged kids thinking they're above the law because of their parents' badges." He spoke loudly enough for the growing audience to hear. When he pulled out his breathalyzer, Amy's confusion turned to disbelief. "I haven't been drinking," she stated firmly. "I've been volunteering at the animal shelter all afternoon. You can call them to verify." But Officer Wells wasn't interested in verification. He made her perform field sobriety tests right there on the sidewalk, walking in a straight line, standing on one leg, following his flashlight with her eyes. All while phones recorded and cars continued to slow down, creating a small traffic jam of curious onlookers. "This is what happens when federal agents think their kids are untouchable," Officer Wells announced to the crowd, clearly playing to his audience. "Let's see what Daddy's FBI badge does for you now." Amy's cheeks burned with humiliation as she heard whispers and saw more phones pointed her way. She recognized faces from school, neighbors she'd known for years, all watching as she was forced to hop on one foot like a circus performer. A young mother shielded her children's eyes as they walked past, hurrying them along as if Amy was some kind of criminal. The same neighbors who'd praised her academic achievements and volunteer work now stared with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Officer Wells dragged out the ordeal, making comments about entitled FBI brats and teaching someone a lesson. Amy's legs shook from exhaustion and stress, but she held herself together, knowing that showing any sign of defiance would only make things worse. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, Officer Wells stepped back. "Consider this a warning," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your daddy's badge won't protect you forever." As Amy got back into her car, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. Through her windshield, she could see people already sharing their videos, no doubt posting them online. By morning, everyone would see her humiliation. The perfect student, the FBI agent's daughter, reduced to a roadside spectacle. What she didn't know then was that this wasn't just about her anymore. This incident would spark something much bigger than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. Something that would shake the entire police department to its core. By midnight, Amy's humiliation had gone viral. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications as the video of her roadside ordeal spread across social media like wildfire. She lay in her darkened bedroom, watching the view count climb higher and higher, each new number feeling like another stone added to the weight on her chest. The comments beneath the video were worse than the footage itself. "FBI princess gets reality check," wrote one user. "About time these privileged kids learn their lesson," posted another. Some people defended her, pointing out the officer's unprofessional behavior, but their voices were drowned out by the wave of mockery and judgment. Sleep was impossible. Every time Amy closed her eyes, she saw Officer Wells's smirking face and the crowd of onlookers with their phones raised. The worst part, her father was away on assignment, and she couldn't bring herself to call and tell him what happened. He had enough on his plate without dealing with her problems. Morning came too quickly. Amy stared at herself in the bathroom mirror, trying to gather courage for what awaited her at school. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her sleepless night, and no amount of concealer seemed to help. Her hands shook as she tried to apply mascara, eventually giving up and leaving her face bare. The drive to school felt like heading to her own execution. At every red light, she noticed people in other cars glancing at her, then quickly looking away. Had they seen the video too? Were they laughing about it in their group chats? The school parking lot was unusually quiet when she arrived. Conversation stopped as she walked past groups of students, only to resume in hurried whispers once she was out of earshot. Even Lily, her best friend since middle school, seemed unsure how to act around her. "I tried to report the video," Lily said softly as they walked to first period, "but it's already been shared too many times. My cousin in California saw it on her feed this morning." The hallways felt endless that day. Amy caught snippets of conversations as she passed. "Did you see? I can't believe her dad's going to be so mad." Each whisper felt like a tiny paper cut, stinging and accumulating until her whole body ached with shame. During lunch, she couldn't face the crowded cafeteria. Instead, she found refuge in the library's back corner, where Mrs. Thompson quietly placed a cup of tea on her table without saying a word. The kind gesture nearly broke her composure. It was the first normal interaction she'd had all day. But the real blow came that afternoon. Ms. Rivera, the college counselor, called her in for an emergency meeting. "Amy," she began gently, "Stanford's admissions office reached out this morning. They've seen the video." Amy's stomach dropped. Stanford had been her dream school since she was 12. Her early application was already being reviewed, and her perfect academic record had made her a strong candidate. "They're concerned about behavior unbecoming of a Stanford student," Ms. Rivera continued, her voice heavy with sympathy. "They've requested a formal explanation of the incident." The words hit Amy like physical blows. Her future, the one she'd worked so hard for, was unraveling because of one officer's power trip and a viral video. Years of perfect grades, community service, student leadership, all potentially undone in a single evening. Walking to her car after school, Amy overheard two freshmen watching the video on their phones, laughing at her clumsy attempts to walk a straight line while Officer Wells mocked her. The sound of their laughter followed her all the way home. That evening, sitting alone in her room, Amy finally broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she typed and deleted message after message to her father. How could she tell him? What would he think? The man who'd taught her about justice and dignity, who'd raised her to be strong and independent, how could she admit that she'd become a viral joke? But as she sat there, something inside Amy began to shift. The shame and humiliation started to transform into something else, a quiet, burning anger. Not just for herself, but for anyone who'd ever been bullied by someone abusing their power. Her father had always taught her that true justice wasn't about revenge, but about making things right. Little did Officer Wells know, his attempt to humiliate one FBI agent's daughter was about to backfire in ways he could never have imagined. Because while Amy might have been knocked down, she was far from defeated. And she wasn't alone. Agent David Chen sat in his temporary office in Washington, D.C., reviewing files for his ongoing case when his phone buzzed. Another message from a colleague. "Have you seen this?" Followed by a link. He'd been getting similar messages all morning, but hadn't had time to check them. This time, something made him pause and click. The moment he saw his daughter's face on the screen, everything else faded away. The bustling office, the important case files, the upcoming meetings, all of it disappeared as he watched Amy being humiliated on the side of the road. His coffee cup trembled in his hand, threatening to spill as his grip tightened with each passing second of the video. "Sir," his assistant knocked on the door. "The director wants to see you about the Thompson case." "Cancel everything," David said quietly, his eyes never leaving the screen. The assistant took one look at his face and quickly backed out of the office. He watched the video 3 times, noting every detail. Officer Wells's badge number, the timestamp, the street signs in the background. His FBI training kicked in automatically, cataloging evidence even as his father's heart ached. The worst part wasn't the officer's behavior, it was Amy's face, trying so hard to stay strong while being publicly shamed. His phone rang. It was his old friend and colleague at the local police department. "Dave, I'm so sorry. I just saw the video. This isn't right." "Tell me about Officer Wells," David replied, his voice controlled despite the storm brewing inside him. "New transfer, been here about 8 months. Some complaints, but nothing stuck." His friend paused. "Looked, Dave, whatever you're thinking." "I'm thinking about my daughter's future," David cut in. "I'm thinking about a police officer who chose to abuse his power. I'm thinking about justice." After hanging up, David did something he hadn't done in years. He called in a personal favor from the FBI's database administrator. Within minutes, he had access to everything he needed. Officer Wells's complete service record, including his time at previous departments. The pattern emerged quickly. Complaints of harassment, particularly targeting young women and teenagers from prominent families. Each time, the complaints mysteriously disappeared. Each time, Wells moved to a new department before things got too hot. David's jaw clenched as he read statement after statement. A judge's daughter intimidated during a traffic stop. A city council member's niece harassed at a routine checkpoint. A state senator's granddaughter reduced to tears during a parking violation. All swept under the rug, all forgotten. Until now. He pulled out his old case notebook, the one he used for his most important investigations. On the first page, he wrote, "Operation Clean Badge." This wouldn't be about revenge. No, this would be about protecting not just Amy, but every other person who might cross paths with officers like Wells. His phone buzzed again. A text from Amy. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have told you." David's heart broke reading those words. His daughter was apologizing for being victimized. He typed back, "Nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart. I'm coming home early. Love you." Looking out his office window at the Washington skyline, David thought about all the times he taught Amy about justice, about doing things the right way, about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Now it was his turn to show her what that really meant. He started making calls, first to Internal Affairs, then to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He pulled up records of similar cases, building a framework for what was to come. This wasn't just about one bad traffic stop anymore. This was about systematic abuse of power, about trust broken between law enforcement and the community. As the sun set over the Capitol, David Chen packed his briefcase with everything he'd need. His colleagues watched him leave, noting the determined set of his shoulders, the purposeful stride in his step. They'd seen that look before, usually right before he broke open a major case. What Officer Wells had failed to realize was that he hadn't just humiliated a teenager that night. He'd awakened something far more dangerous, a father's protective instinct combined with an FBI agent's investigative skills and resources. The real question wasn't whether justice would come. The question was, would anyone see it coming before it was too late? The pieces of the puzzle started falling into place as Agent Chen dug deeper into Officer Wells's past. Each new discovery was like turning over a rock and finding something darker underneath. Sitting in his home office late at night, surrounded by stacks of papers and multiple computer screens, David pieced together a troubling pattern. "Look at this," he said to his old police academy friend, Detective Thompson, who'd stopped by to help. 3 different departments in 5 years. Each time, he left just before any serious investigation could start. The detective leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. And always the same type of complaints. Young women, usually from prominent families. He's been playing this game for years. They'd spent the past week gathering testimonies from Wells's previous victims. A lawyer's daughter from Ohio, terrified to drive alone after her encounter with him. The business owner's niece in Pennsylvania, who'd given up her dream of becoming a police officer after her experience. Each story added another layer to their investigation. "Dad." Amy's soft knock interrupted their work. She stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. Her eyes fell on the wall covered with photos and documents. "Is that all because of me?" David got up and hugged his daughter. "No, sweetheart. This is because of him. You just happened to be the one who finally exposed it." Amy placed the coffee cups down and picked up one of the statements. Her hands trembled slightly as she read. "There are so many others. That's why we're doing this right," Detective Thompson said gently. "No shortcuts, no revenge. Pure, clean justice." As Amy left the room, David noticed her walking taller, shoulders straighter. She was beginning to understand that her humiliation might serve a greater purpose. The breakthrough came 3 days later. A former police dispatcher reached out after seeing Amy's viral video. She had kept detailed records of every complaint against Wells that had been mysteriously lost in the system. Her hands shook as she handed over a thick folder. "I couldn't sleep at night, knowing what was happening," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I was afraid of losing my job. I have kids to support." David read through her documentation, his expression growing grimmer with each page. Not only had Wells targeted vulnerable young women, but senior officers had helped cover it up. The corruption went deeper than anyone had suspected. The evidence was damning. Deleted dashcam footage, altered reports, witnesses pressured into silence. Wells had built a network of protection through intimidation and favors, but he'd gotten sloppy. Confident in his immunity, he'd started leaving traces. Late one evening, as David was reviewing security footage from the police station, something caught his eye. The camera showed Wells in the evidence room, removing files from a box marked "Civilian Complaints." David zoomed in, enhanced the image, and smiled for the first time in days. "Got you," he whispered. He immediately called Detective Thompson. "Remember that missing evidence from the Henderson case. Check the timestamp on this footage." The next morning, David met with the FBI's Internal Affairs liaison. The evidence was overwhelming. Systematic abuse of power, destruction of evidence, witness intimidation. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. While examining Wells's financial records, they found irregular deposits to his account. Further investigation revealed a disturbing side business. Wells had been selling information about prominent families to local criminals, using his traffic stops to gather intelligence about their homes, routines, and security systems. David sat back in his chair, running his hands through his graying hair. This had evolved from a case of police harassment into something much bigger. Wells wasn't just a bully with a badge. He was a criminal hiding behind one. At home that evening, Amy found her father in the kitchen, making his signature stress relief pasta sauce. "You look different, Dad," she said, helping him chop vegetables. "Like you used to look when you were close to solving a big case." David smiled at his daughter. "Sometimes, sweetheart, bad things happen to good people. But sometimes those bad things lead to something important, something bigger than ourselves." He didn't tell her about the briefing scheduled for tomorrow, with the police commissioner and the district attorney. He didn't mention the surveillance teams already in place, watching Wells's every move. He didn't need to. The wheels of justice were turning, and Officer Wells had no idea he was about to be caught in their unstoppable momentum. The morning of the big meeting arrived with a tension in the air that felt almost electric. David straightened his tie in the mirror, thinking about how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The case he built was solid, a fortress of evidence that would be impossible to ignore or sweep under the rug. The police commissioner's conference room was packed. Senior officers sat shoulder to shoulder with internal affairs investigators and representatives from the district attorney's office. David noticed Officer Wells sitting near the back, looking smug and unbothered. He clearly thought this was just another routine meeting. "Thank you all for coming," David began, his voice steady and professional. "What I'm about to present will be difficult for some of you to hear, but it's necessary." The lights dimmed as the first slides appeared on the screen. Timeline after timeline, evidence after evidence. David had organized everything perfectly, starting with Amy's incident and working backward through years of complaints, corrupted investigations, and covered-up misconduct. Wells's expression changed gradually as the presentation continued. The smirk faded, replaced by a tightness around his eyes. When David played the security footage, showing him removing files from the evidence room, Wells shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But this goes beyond harassment," David continued, clicking to the next slide. "We've uncovered evidence of a criminal enterprise operating within the department." The room erupted in murmurs as David revealed the bank records. Multiple accounts, suspicious transfers, connections to known criminal organizations. Wells had been using his position to gather intelligence on wealthy families, selling their personal information to the highest bidder. "This isn't just about my daughter anymore," David said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This is about every citizen who trusted us to protect them, only to become victims themselves." The police commissioner's face grew darker with each new revelation. Several senior officers looked physically ill as they recognized their own names in the cover-up documentation. The district attorney's representative was already making calls, likely arranging for arrest warrants. Wells suddenly stood up, heading for the door, but 2 FBI agents were already there. "Officer Michael Wells," one began, "you're under arrest." The room watched in stunned silence as Wells was handcuffed and led away. But David wasn't finished. His presentation continued, outlining the systemic failures that had allowed this situation to develop. The lack of oversight, the culture of protection, the ignored warnings. "We have a chance here," David concluded, "to not just remove one bad officer, but to rebuild trust with our community. To show them that justice isn't just a word we use, but a principle we live by." The aftermath was immediate. The commissioner announced an independent review of all complaints filed in the past 5 years. 3 senior officers resigned on the spot. The district attorney's office began preparing multiple indictments. Walking out of the building, David felt lighter than he had in weeks. His phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "How did it go?" He smiled, typing back, "Come home early. We have a lot to talk about." That evening, sitting in their favorite ice cream parlor, David watched his daughter absorb everything he told her about the meeting. Her eyes widened at the scope of what had been uncovered. "So it wasn't just about me?" she asked, stirring her melting sundae. "No, honey. You were just the catalyst. The one person brave enough to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' Sometimes that's all it takes to bring down a whole house of cards." Amy was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "You know what's funny? All those times you taught me about justice and doing things the right way. I finally understand what you meant." Outside, reporters were already gathering at the police station as news of the arrests spread. Social media was buzzing with updates, but this time the tone was different. The same platforms that had once mocked Amy were now praising the exposure of corruption. David watched his daughter finish her ice cream, noting how she sat straighter now, confident again. She'd learned something valuable, that sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the most important changes. And somewhere in a holding cell, Officer Wells was learning his own lesson, that true justice, when it finally arrives, comes not with a bang of revenge, but with the quiet, unstoppable force of truth. The city's largest press conference room was packed wall to wall. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like Christmas decorations. David stood backstage, adjusting his tie one last time, while Amy sat quietly beside him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked her softly. "You don't have to." Amy nodded, smoothing down her blazer. "People need to hear the whole story, Dad. Not just from law enforcement, but from someone who lived it." The police commissioner stepped up to the podium first, his face grave as he addressed the crowd. "Good morning. Today, we're here to address one of the most significant cases of police misconduct in our department's history." Cameras flashed as he detailed the initial findings: dozens of victims, years of corruption, and a network of cover-ups that had finally been exposed. The room grew eerily quiet as he played selected dashcam footage showing Officer Wells's pattern of harassment. Then it was David's turn. He walked to the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. 2 weeks ago, my daughter was humiliated during a routine traffic stop. But what happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. He presented the evidence methodically, his FBI training showing in every precise word and gesture. The bank records appeared on the screen behind him, followed by surveillance footage, witness statements, and internal documents. Officer Wells didn't just abuse his power, David continued. He sold information about vulnerable citizens to criminal organizations. He used his badge not to protect, but to profit from fear and intimidation. The reporter's hand shot up like a forest of reaching branches, but David wasn't finished. However, this isn't just about one corrupt officer. This is about a system that protected him, a system that needs to change. Then came the moment that would make headlines across the country. Amy stood up and walked to the podium. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "My name is Amy Chen," she said, her voice clear and strong. 2 weeks ago, I was that girl in the viral video, being humiliated on the side of the road. But today, I'm here to tell you about all the others who suffered in silence." She shared stories from other victims, their names changed to protect their privacy. The teenager who developed anxiety attacks after her encounter with Wells. The young mother who took longer routes to work to avoid his patrol area. The college student who dropped out because she was afraid to drive to campus. "What happened to me was painful," Amy continued, "but it led to something important. It showed us that one voice speaking up can inspire others to do the same." The questions from reporters came rapid fire. Was this investigation motivated by personal revenge? How many officers were involved in the cover-up? What changes will be implemented to prevent this from happening again? David stepped back to the podium, addressing each question with careful consideration. He announced new oversight measures, improved complaint procedures, and mandatory body camera policies. But it was his final statement that captured everyone's attention. "To every officer who honors their badge and serves with integrity, we see you. To every citizen who has lost faith in law enforcement, we hear you. And to anyone who thinks a badge gives them power without responsibility, we're watching you." After the press conference, Amy found herself surrounded by other young women, former victims of Wells who had come forward after seeing her story. They shared hugs, tears, and promises to stay in touch. What had started as one girl's humiliation had grown into a movement for change. Walking to their car, David and Amy passed Officer Wells's former patrol car, now parked empty in the station lot. Amy paused for a moment, looking at it. "You know what's strange, Dad," she said. "I'm actually grateful it happened to me. Because if it hadn't, who knows how long he would have kept hurting people." David put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, feeling a surge of pride. She had transformed from a victim into a voice for change, and nothing could make him prouder. As they drove home, local news radio was already broadcasting clips from the press conference. The story was spreading, but this time it wasn't about humiliation. It was about hope, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. The city would never be quite the same after today, and neither would Amy. The courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of Officer Wells's hearing. The marble halls echoed with whispers and footsteps as people filed into the courtroom. Amy sat in the front row, her father beside her, watching as other victims and their families filled the benches behind them. Wells looked different now, his confident swagger replaced by slumped shoulders and a wrinkled suit. When he glanced around the courtroom, his eyes widened at the sight of all the faces he recognized. Not just Amy, but dozens of his former victims who had come to witness justice being served. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver hair, called the court to order. "We are here today to address multiple charges against former Officer Michael Wells, including abuse of power, evidence tampering, and criminal conspiracy." The district attorney stood, her voice filling the courtroom as she presented the case. Evidence flashed across screens: dashcam footage, bank records, testimony after testimony. Each piece told part of a larger story of corruption and abuse. Amy squeezed her father's hand as they played the video of her traffic stop. This time, watching it didn't bring shame. Instead, she felt strength, knowing it had helped expose years of wrongdoing. But perhaps most disturbing, the DA continued, is the defendant's involvement in selling sensitive information to criminal organizations, putting countless families at risk. Wells' attorney attempted to paint his client as a victim of the system, claiming he was just following established practices, but the evidence was overwhelming. When it was time for victim impact statements, Amy was the first to step forward. Standing at the podium, she looked directly at Wells. "What you did wasn't just about power or control. It was about making people feel helpless. But you failed. Instead of breaking us, you made us stronger." One by one, other victims shared their stories. A young teacher described how Wells had harassed her until she changed jobs. A college student explained how she developed panic attacks after her encounter with him. Each story added another brick to the wall of evidence against him. The judge listened intently, her expression growing sterner with each testimony. When Wells was finally given a chance to speak, he offered a half-hearted apology that rang hollow in the quiet courtroom. "This court has heard overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse of power," the judge began her ruling. "When someone wears a badge, they accept a sacred trust with their community. Mr. Wells not only broke that trust, he weaponized it." The sentence came down like a thunderclap. 15 years in federal prison, no possibility of early parole. Wells seemed to shrink in his seat as the judge detailed additional penalties: permanent loss of his law enforcement certification, mandatory restitution to victims, and a lifetime ban from any position of public authority. But the judge wasn't finished. Looking out at the courtroom, she addressed the larger issue. "Let this case serve as a warning to anyone who would abuse their position of authority. The badge is meant to protect, not to intimidate. It represents service, not power." Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around as David spoke to the press. "Today isn't about revenge," he said clearly. "It's about accountability. It's about making sure that no other young person has to fear those who are meant to protect them." Amy stood beside her father, noticing how many young faces were in the crowd. Some were filming on their phones. But this time, the videos would tell a different story, one of justice and positive change. Later that evening, Amy received an unexpected email from Stanford's admissions office. They had reviewed her case and the recent events. Her acceptance letter was attached, along with a personal note praising her courage in standing up against abuse of power. At home, she found her father in the kitchen, attempting to bake her favorite celebration cake, somewhat unsuccessfully, judging by the flour covering his FBI badge on the counter. "Dad," she said, showing him the Stanford email, "I think I know what I want to study now. I want to become a civil rights attorney." David looked at his daughter, seeing not the scared teen from that traffic stop, but a strong young woman who had helped change her community for the better. "I think you'd be perfect for that," he said, pulling her into a flowery hug. As they cleaned up the kitchen together, the evening news played in the background, discussing the broader implications of the case. Police departments across the country were reviewing their oversight procedures. New training programs were being implemented. Real change was happening. And it all started because one girl refused to let injustice have the final word. 6 months later, Amy stood at a podium in the National Police Reform Conference, looking out at a sea of faces. The journey from that humiliating traffic stop to this moment felt like a lifetime. When I was pulled over that night, she began, her voice steady and clear. I never imagined it would lead me here. I was just a teenager who felt powerless and afraid. But sometimes, our lowest moments become turning points. The audience listened intently. Police chiefs, civil rights attorneys, community leaders, and reform advocates from across the country. Among them sat her father, David, beaming with pride. The easy path would have been revenge, Amy continued. But my father taught me something important. True justice isn't about getting even. It's about making things right. Not just for yourself, but for everyone. She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from their city's new police oversight program. Civilian complaints were down 60%. Body camera compliance was at 98%. Most importantly, community trust scores had risen dramatically. What happened in our city wasn't just about one bad officer, she explained. It was about changing the system. And change, real change, starts with honest conversations like the ones we're having today. During the break, several young people approached Amy, sharing their own stories of encounters with law enforcement. Instead of tales of fear and resentment, they talked about hope and progress. The new policies implemented after Wells's case had already prevented similar incidents. A police chief from another state asked Amy to consult on their department's reform program. Your story helped us recognize problems in our own system, he admitted. We want to fix things before they break. Back at their hotel room that evening, David ordered their favorite pizza, a tradition since Amy was little. As they ate, she showed him the acceptance letters from several law schools, including Yale and Harvard. Stanford's still my first choice, though, she said, smiling. Their civil rights program is exactly what I want to do. David watched his daughter, remembering the scared girl from that viral video. Now she sat before him, confident and purposeful, already making plans to help others through law and advocacy. You know, he said, wiping pizza sauce from his chin, when I first saw that video of you being humiliated, I wanted to tear the world apart. But you showed me a better way. Amy nodded, thinking about everything that had changed. Her former viral shame had transformed into a movement. The support group she'd started for victims of police misconduct had chapters in 12 states now. Even her social media, once filled with mockery, now received messages of gratitude and hope. The next morning, they visited the local police academy, where Amy had been invited to speak to new recruits. Looking at the fresh faces in blue uniforms, she shared not just her story, but her vision for the future. Your badge isn't just a symbol of authority, she told them. It's a promise to your community, a promise to protect, to serve, to do what's right, even when no one's watching. After her speech, a young female cadet approached her with tears in her eyes. I almost quit the academy after seeing how Officer Wells abused his power, she confessed. But your story made me realize we need good people in law enforcement more than ever. On the flight home, Amy scrolled through photos from the conference. There she was with civil rights leaders, police reformers, and community activists. Each picture represented a step toward positive change. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lily, her best friend. Look what I found. Attached was the old viral video of her traffic stop, but now the comments were completely different. This girl's story changed everything. One read. Real hero, said another. As the plane descended toward home, Amy thought about the upcoming semester at Stanford. She'd already been invited to join their law review and had plans to intern at a civil rights firm. The future was bright with possibility. David gently squeezed her hand as they landed. Proud of you, kiddo, he said simply. Amy smiled, thinking about all the other daughters, sons, and families who would never have to go through what she did. Sometimes the worst moments in life led to the most important changes. Her humiliation had become a catalyst for reform, her pain transformed into purpose. And that was the greatest revenge of all. Not destruction, but creation. Not punishment, but progress. A better future built one change at a time.